we've had an internal Bulwark disagreement about Chris Christie. I've been very, very critical of Chris Christie. I had a big rant about Chris Christie. I will never forgive him for that moment when he went all Shinebox back in 2016 and endorsed Donald Trump. But the guy has been a magnificent and I would say courageous beast in taking on Trumpism. And now, where would he speak over the weekend? He's down in Florida.
Florida Republican Forum Conference.
Okay, so this was a very MAGA-heavy event. Asa Hutchinson, who I was slightly surprised is still in the race, also spoke. Got a very negative reception. But let's play Chris Christie, who basically stands up there, and the crowd hates him. They're booing him, almost booed him off the stage. But listen to this.
Your anger against the truth is reprehensible.
Whoa! Truth to MAGA. Reprehensible.
And as people watch today, if your arguments are so strong, if your arguments are so great, and mine are so bad, then just keep quiet. Let me make my awful arguments, and then you can just reject them out of hand. But the problem is you fear the truth.
Oh.
The problem is you want to shout down any voice that says anything different than what you want to hear. And you can continue to do it, and believe me, it doesn't bother me one bit.
I don't know whether it bothers him, but I got to tell you, one thing that people even forget about people in politics and people who are in the public life, they're still people. I know this is like, well, really, remember, they actually are human beings. I mean, they are people. And I understand that Chris Christie has a lot of thick skin and a lot of ego, but it is not fun standing up in a room where everybody hates your guts and they're yelling at you. That is not fun. But what I think is amazing is that he's at the point of being all out of bleeps to give. And he comes this close to saying, you are effing deplorable. You are. You know, what are you sniveling cowards afraid of here? You know, you're clinging to your ignorance. You're reprehensible. That was a magnificent moment. But clearly, the Republican Party the primary electorate doesn't care.
Right. Well, the people in that room don't care. And it's a question of who's in that room. But I think this is why, look, I really like Chris Christie too. And I had the same feeling that you did about him in 2016. This guy did more than anyone else to help Donald Trump win the nomination and then the election. So the thing that I like about Christie, and I sounds like you do too, is he's the realest person in that race. He just talks like a guy, right? He goes into a room. A politician panders. That's not pandering. Right. What we just heard, right? That's the opposite.
That was not fan service. Because I mean, like 90% of these guys is like, what button can I push, to get their political erogenous zone aroused? Now he's like, screw it. I'm going to tell you what I think.
And Charlie, it wasn't even a nice version of disagreement. I have never heard, and I don't think I ever will again, a politician walk into a room that he knows is against him, and say, your anger is reprehensible? To tell the people in the audience they're reprehensible? Now, I want to just flag one thing from that clip that might have gone by some folks listening. There was a phrase that Chris Christie said. It was, as people watch today. Do you hear that part? That's just a preposition he dropped in there. In other words, Christie went to this thing knowing that the room was against him, the room full of MAGA people, right? But that's not his audience. His audience is anyone outside who's either watching the event, which is not that many people, or who will see a video clip, or who will hear us talking about it, or who will read about it, right? So he's talking to everyone outside the room about the people inside the room. And he's saying to the people outside, oh, I'm with you. I'm with you sane people against these lunatics in the room. But I still respect him for the courage to go in and do that.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good point. Okay, so another really interesting soundbite over the weekend. I think we've been waiting for a long time for members of the American media to emulate the British media, the Australian media. I mean, have you ever noticed the difference between, say, a BBC interview and an American network interview? The BBC interviews, first of all, they don't let you filibuster. And they keep asking the same question over and over. I mean, they keep pressing it. Mehdi Hassan is very much from that tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But American interviews too often, look, and I understand the limits of time and the limits of the format. I mean, I'm sympathetic. It's not as easy as it looks. But George Stephanopoulos had Steve Scalise on yesterday. And he's asking him about whether the election was stolen. And by the way, I think this is a relevant question to ask, not because it's backward looking, but because it's forward looking. Because the real question is, will Republicans ever concede the 2024 election? I mean, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but is Donald Trump ever going to acknowledge that he loses next year? If he loses next year, and will it become then an absolute litmus test for Republicans in the House of Representatives to reject the results of the Electoral College? I think it's more than a 50-50 chance. We've seen that with the unanimous vote for Mike Johnson, one of the full-throated election denialists. So Steve Scalise, who also was kneecapped by the Slavering Jackal Caucus, is on with George Stephanopoulos, and I was really struck by how many times Stephanopoulos asked him the question. I mean, so let's listen. It's about 2 minutes long, right? Well, it's about 2 minutes. Let's listen to this.
Can you say unequivocally that the 2020 election was not stolen?
What I've told you is there are states that didn't follow their laws. That is what the state constitution, the U.S. Constitution requires. I've seen in my own state where we had to send our elections commissioner to jail years ago for fraud and corruption, and we cleaned up our act in our state. Every state ought to follow the laws that are on their books. That's what the U.S. Constitution says.
That's not what I asked. I said, can you say unequivocally that the 2020 election was not stolen?
Twice. Second question.
Look, Joe Biden's president. I know you and others want to talk about 2020. We're focused on the future. We've talked about 2020 a lot. We're talking about how to get our country back on track, how to get our economy moving, how to stand up to the bad actors around the world. Xi is not slowing down in China. He's looking at Taiwan. You see what's going on in Russia. You see what Iran is doing to work with Hamas and other terrorist organizations. This administration needs to pick up the pace. They're not standing up to the bad actors around the world. They need to. We're passing bills to address this through the House. The Senate needs to take action. The president needs to take action as well. That's what we're focused on in the House.
I know that Joe Biden is president. I'm asking you a different question. Can you say unequivocally that the 2020 election was not stolen?
Third time.
What I've told you, and you've seen this, there are states that didn't follow the laws that are on their books, which is what the U.S. Constitution says.
Okay, he's in a loop.
They have to do.
So you just refuse to say unequivocally that the 2020 election was not stolen?
So you want to keep rehashing 2020?
Yes.
We're talking.
I just want an answer to the question, yes or no.
Threats to this country.
Five
we've
times.
asked, look, we've talked about this before, but again, will you acknowledge that there were states that didn't follow the actual state legislative enacted laws on their books, which the U.S. Constitution says they're supposed to do?
I know that every court that looked at whether the election was stolen said it wasn't, rejected those claims. And I asked you a very, very simple question. Now I've asked it, I think, the fifth time that you can't appear to answer. Can you say unequivocally that the 2020 election was not stolen?
I told you there were a handful of states that didn't follow their laws. The rest did.
Oh my. Okay, Will. If I smoked, I would light up a cigarette after that one. Good on George Stephanopoulos. 6 times in 2 minutes. And Steve Scalise, what a weasel and a wimp. Because first of all, I mean, okay, never mind. Go ahead. What do you think, Will?
Okay, just to get the numbers out. All right, we spared the audience here. You just heard 6 of them. There are 9. There are not. Stephanopoulos asks this question 9 times in 5 minutes. He goes on. Now, just so everybody understands how these interviews work, the host has a list of questions that they want to get to, right?
Right.
So if every time you stop on a question, you're giving up a couple of minutes that you want to relate a question. Right. I gotta praise George Stephanopoulos. He's willing to chuck every question below that on his list. He's willing to spend the rest of the interview repeating that question until he gets an answer because it's important. And let's remember, Stephanopoulos is the guy who, was at the first Republican debate, when 6 of the 8 raised their hands and said that they would support Trump even if he were convicted, right? He did the same thing. He asked a question about that. Why would you do that? Nikki Haley refused to answer. I forget who else he had on the show. Anyway, he is willing to tank the interview for that one question.
Well, I think he's growing, right?
Yeah, what he got out of that was great. And just to your point, Charlie, about what Scalise actually said and the plausibility of whether the House Republicans would block the election results, let's remember the number of elections that Donald Trump has been a candidate in which he has conceded defeat is 0. Am I correct?
0.
Remember? So there's no
when he
reason
lost
to
in
believe.
Iowa, I mean, always. He's never a gracious loser, ever.
Right.
Yeah, and we know what he will demand. He will demand that House Republicans do the courageous thing and throw out the election results, right? If he wins.
And it would have been easy for Scalise to say that
Yes.
the election wasn't stolen, but he won't even say that. And you can hear him coming up with the rationale. The states didn't follow their laws. Now, this was all certified by courts, but Scalise and the Republicans don't care about courts, right? And therefore, because they didn't follow their laws as they were written before COVID, that's unconstitutional. Scalise is basically saying that the 2020 election, as it was conducted, was unconstitutional. He's saying that it was stolen.